Okay, thank you all. I would like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land. A long time ago, and for a long while, Perth was a home to me, and it's always a pleasure and a privilege to be able to come back and see the beautiful blue skies and to meet up with people who I worked with many years ago, probably about 15 years ago now, when I was first suggesting or trying to suggest that there was a link between attitudes towards gender and certain practices of masculinity in the mining sector that were negatively impacting on people's health and well-being. We didn't necessarily get a good response at that time, but I had some very powerful support from, I know, a few people that are in the audience today. So what I want to do today is I want to share with you the findings of a recent roadshow that we conducted around Western Australia in some of the mining regions, asking people, how tough are we now in the industry? And this is on the back of a previous roadshow that we ran in 2010, asking how tough are we in the industry? So essentially this recent roadshow was to ask, what has changed? So what did we find? We found back in 2010. We found that we were really at the beginning of a discussion around linking gender with safety. This idea that there were certain ways of understanding what it meant to be a man, what it meant to be a woman, that were affecting the way that people were thinking about and doing safety in the industry. We found that it was difficult to have a conversation about that because people were thinking about gender maybe as women in the mining industry, but that's as much as they understood gender and its importance in the industry at that time. We wanted to explore differences. We wanted to go beyond the women in mining debate, and we wanted to think a little bit more deeply around safety and workplace culture linked to gender. We couldn't at that time specifically talk about issues such as sexual harassment, sexual abuse, sexual violence. We couldn't use those terms. We had to be a little bit more general by talking about toughness, because the language was not there, the understanding was not there for us to have that conversation. We already recognized perhaps that there was an issue, or certainly I recognized that there was an issue, but we had to start at a very simple base. In 2010, what we found was it wasn't that there was no diversity in the industry. We couldn't say that there were not women working in the industry. We couldn't say that there were not LGBT people working in the industry in Western Australia. But what we could say, what we did find from the roadshow back in 2010, was that there was an enormous pressure, and often active pressure, to stop that diversity from flourishing in the industry. That behaviors such as bullying and sexual harassment and sexual violence were being used as a tool to ensure that people of diverse color, diverse gender, diverse sexual orientation could not fit in to the industry. But we also found at the time that there was a voice within the industry that said, we no longer want this. We no longer want it to be this way. We want some change. So recently in May, and I want to thank Demers for the opportunity to come back to WA and to run the roadshow again around Western Australia. I want to thank the regional inspectors and the mental health and wellbeing inspectors who accompanied me on the roadshow and made things very smooth. And I want to thank the 177 people working in the industry who gave up their time to come and participate in the roadshow workshops, including people who were told they were not to go. We met one particular person he was a safety professional working in the sector whose manager said, this is not for you. And so that person took a day off to attend the workshop. So there was a huge commitment from the people in this workshop to share what was happening, what were they thinking right now about toughness in the industry and how it was affecting their work. And I think one of the key outcomes from it, and hugely shocking, surprising, but also a great pleasure to me, was to be able to have conversations with people around sexual harassment, sexual violence, etc., that we could not have had 13 years ago. There was now a language, there was now an understanding, there was now a willingness to be open and to have discussions around these sensitive topics. That people were more aware of the psychosocial harms that were happening on their mind sites. That sexual harassment was no longer a taboo topic. People were willing to talk about it. Words like transgender, disability, First Nations, LGBT, these were not words that we heard in the Roadshow workshops in 2010, but these were words that people were comfortable talking about in the Roadshow that we did this year. The purpose of the Roadshow was not to ask, is there a problem? We didn't need to ask the attendees, are there behaviors going on that are putting you at risk of psychosocial harm, that are harming you psychosocially? We didn't need to ask that question. That was not our purpose. We already knew from the reports, many of which have been spoken about today, that there was an issue, and a big issue. And we knew before those reports, I think this is important to remember, we knew before those reports that there was an issue around harassment, around hypermasculinity, around attitudes towards diversity, towards women, towards First Nations people. We knew there was a problem in the industry. The research has been there for much longer than the reports, the recent reports that have come out in Western Australia and throughout Australia. I knew back in 2010 as somebody working in the industry that there was a problem because I was experiencing the issues on a daily basis being out in sight, and I was talking to people and working with people who were also experiencing those issues. What we wanted to ask, what we wanted to find out is, okay, we know that this problem is there. We know that you've been addressing the problem. What have you been doing? What have your companies been doing to respond to these psychosocial risks? We wanted to hear about positive stories. What is working? What have you heard that is helping either your company or individuals in your company to have a safer and a happier workplace? We wanted to try and dig down a little bit more into what are the specific psychosocial risk factors right now, and are there any particular groups of people who might be more at risk than others? And we wanted to ask them exactly as we'd asked them in 2010, what do you think would make for a friendlier, happier workplace? What is needed? We asked you this 13 years ago. We wanted to ask again. As a result of the workshops, these are the findings that we have. So I've split these into looking at it from a prevention and also a response perspective. So on the prevention side, psychosocial incident prevention, what did we find out? We found at a policy level that most companies have policies in place, that this is now standard practice, that these policies have been written, they've been adopted. We found, however, that the policies had usually been created without input from workers in general, or specifically from workers who are most at risk of psychosocial harm in the workplace. So they're being written from a top-down perspective. The question therefore exists whether these policies are effective for the people most at risk. We also found that the policies are not regularly being reviewed in terms of updating them, but also measuring the impact of those policies to make sure that they're working. From a training perspective, we learned that it is now commonplace for most people in the industry, according to what the workshop attendees said, to receive some kind of training on issues such as sexual harassment. That is there. People are being told what it is, they're being introduced to it, they're being told about how to report and disciplinary consequences if sexual harassment occurs. As a result of that training, that's why we see that increase in understanding and that increase in willingness to talk about these issues. What we didn't see was training that is necessarily considered good practice around sexual harassment, sexual assault, sexual violence, etc. We're hearing that a lot of the training is one-off, in some cases tick-the-box training. It can often be top-down, as in, these are the behaviors we don't do. Do you understand that we don't do them? Good, we're finished. We found that kind of training is more common than the training that we know to be more effective in terms of addressing these behaviors, which is interactive training, training that allows people to question, to understand, to be open about the confusion that they have around these issues, and training that is ongoing in shorter sessions rather than a single session, one single talk. We asked the people about their leaders. Leaders, we have work to do. The people at the workshop were concerned that their senior leadership are saying, on the one hand, we want to address these issues, but they are not seeing their senior leaders participate in efforts to address those issues. They are not seeing senior leaders attend the same training programs that they are required to attend. There is a concern expressed by the people in the workshops that senior leaders believe the problem of harassment, verbal abuse, discrimination, this is a problem of workers. It is not my problem as a senior leader. I don't engage in this behavior. It doesn't affect me. It is your problem. We have given you some training to address that problem. The workers, the people we spoke to, are concerned, very concerned, that there's not a higher level of engagement by senior leaders. They also, however, pointed out that they feel there is a lack of advice for senior leaders on how to get involved and how to be active in this work. We saw that there was little evidence of learning from incidents, that incidents are being responded to, investigated, and maybe there is some disciplinary action coming out of that, but there is a lack of using those incidents to understand how can we do things better. How can we put in place certain more controls or improve our controls to ensure that these incidents don't happen again? We could easily identify by talking to the people attending the workshops, they could tell us who the people in their organizations were who were responsible for responding to incidents. They could not tell us who was responsible for preventing these incidents from happening. We also found that we can talk more openly around issues such as discrimination and sexual harassment. But we are not hearing about some of the more taboo topics. So while in the past 13 years, from my perspective, we've moved from not being able to talk about sexual harassment to being able to talk about sexual harassment, we are still not talking about issues such as male-male sexual violence on mine sites, which we also know is happening. So the key lessons that we had from the workshop in terms of prevention of psychosocial incidents was there's significantly improved language and awareness of some of the gaps. This is great, that we have this language, we're aware of what we need to do, and there is a motivation to continue that work. We found that there is a need for more training with improvement in how that training is delivered and the content of that training. We found, and one of the lessons is that we need to have more emphasis on empowerment. At the moment, what we're seeing is there's a lot of work around protection of workers from these incidents. But what we need also is a shift towards the empowerment of workers to be able to manage and respond to these incidents. We found as well that there is more emphasis on don't do this behavior, don't do that behavior, instead of an engaged debate on why is it that when I do that at this particular time somebody responds this way? Why is it when I do that in another particular time for another person they respond in a different way? Rather than having that list of do nots, that there needs to be more of an engaged debate. So based on that, the recommendations of the report that has been written from the Roadshow, which is coming out soon, I believe, very soon, within days, the recommendations that I'm making for the companies in the industry is this need to plan. Don't think of this work, and this has been said a few times over the day today, this is not something that's going to happen quickly. This is something that's going to take a while. It needs resources. It needs planning. We need to, there's a recommendation around having more engaged updates to policies. Engaging workers who are at risk, who understand the risks, and asking them to be part of working groups to review your internal policies. A recommendation to move towards that more interactive, empowering training that doesn't tell me what I cannot do, but allows me an opportunity to discuss how I understand the issue right now and to learn tools and language in order to be able to change my own behaviors as well as those around me. The recommendation is to have discussion. Every opportunity that you have, toolbox talks, weekly meetings, safe starts, have a couple of minutes within those meetings to speak about these issues. Don't isolate it to induction or a particular training module. Bring the discussion around these behaviors into the daily conversations on site. And as I've mentioned, with the issue with the leadership involvement, the recommendation is that there needs to be increased senior leader participation. Participation in existing programs, but also, and again, we've heard this earlier this morning, the involvement in leaders in transformative learning, recognizing that the underlying causes, some of the root causes of these behaviors are linked to power, privilege, which many leaders have, and to be able to understand that and to understand how to use power and privilege in a way to change behaviors. When we looked at response, we were asking the attendees at the workshop, what is your company doing right now to respond to these incidents when they occur, when they are reported? We asked them, how confident are you in the effectiveness of the reporting system that you have in place right now? And 64% said that they were confident in that system. I think based on the other discussions we had, they're overestimating the effectiveness of the systems they have in place. And certainly when we break this down by the regions as well, we see that the people who attended in Perth are far more confident in the effectiveness of their systems than the people in the regional areas. We see also an equivalent percentage of people who have a confidence in understanding the response system that they have in place. So they understand it and they have some level of confidence in it. And then we were having some more discussions, deeper discussions on, well, what is good practice of responding to these incidents versus the system that you have in place right now? And we identified 4 major gaps related to the reporting channels that are being used in the industry in Western Australia for reporting behaviors that cause psychosocial harm. The first one is that there seems to be a pressure to not report anonymously. Most companies have an anonymous reporting channel available, is what the attendees were saying, but there's always a preference in the training, in the discussions for the report to not be made anonymously. And the reason for this, I think, is because there is a belief that all reports need to be thoroughly investigated, finding out what the truth of the incident is with an outcome that results in disciplinary action. That there is no space within that thinking for somebody to say, this is happening at the moment, I just want to have a conversation around what is happening to me, I want to test to see if I trust you, I want to see what is available to me in terms of support. So that is potentially reducing the number of reports that are coming through. We found with the reporting channels that the reporting channels have not been set up by the workers. Again, there's lack of engagement with the workers on what reporting channels are most effective for them, or that they would feel comfortable using, that these are reporting channels that have been set by senior leaders or by HR because they're workable from that perspective, but not necessarily workable for the people that need them. We found that the same reporting channels are expected to work for everybody, and yet the level of risk is different for different people. There was no understanding or no consideration of that some reporting channels might be more appropriate for others, for different people. And we found that the reporting channels or the reporting procedure is not being monitored. It's set up, it's there, it's assumed that it's working, and there is little oversight, little check on whether this is working or not. We also found that there is a high risk of somebody who does report receiving a negative response. So again, we're talking to these people in the industry. We're asking them, what are the systems you have in place right now? What happens when a report is made? What kind of process gets put in place? And based on that conversation, there are 3 reasons why we think there is a likelihood that if I was to report an incident, that I would receive a negative response. So it would be a negative experience for me as the affected person. The first reason for that is a lack of training for the people who have been assigned responsibility to receive those reports. That there is not a deep understanding that we are dealing with sensitive issues. There are certain ways of responding to people who have experienced sexual harassment or bullying or sexual violence. These are skills that need to be learned if we are putting people in place, expecting them to respond to those reports. We found that there were actions being taken, so the unsafe responses, actions being taken that were not necessarily in the best interest of the person who is making the report. Decisions being made on their behalf, forcibly being moved to other areas of the work for their protection, even though they didn't request that. We found that there were examples of companies bringing in the affected person and the alleged perpetrator into the same room so that they can have a conversation about what has happened and forcing that mediation, which we know not to be a very effective or safe way of dealing with these incidents. We found that there is often a requirement for people who are reporting these incidents to prove that it happened before anything else is done. And we found that there is not a very strong survivor-centered response being taken in the sense that I, as a survivor, am respected, I'm believed, I am involved in the decision-making about what happens next, I am the owner of my story, of the experience. All of that was going out of the window. Decisions being made on my behalf. So the likelihood of me receiving a positive experience after reporting is low. If I have a negative experience when I make a report, and then I tell my colleague of that negative experience or my friend, that reduces the likelihood that my colleague, who is also possibly experiencing the same issues, will report that issue, because they understand that the experience of reporting is negative. And importantly, and I think this is a key lesson from the workshops, there seems to be, maybe misunderstanding is not the right word here that's on the slide, but some confusion, some lack of knowledge or gaps in knowledge, gaps in tools around what does it mean to conduct an investigation into these reports. We were hearing that the default position when a report comes in is to jump to full investigation involving all parties, regardless of the wishes of the people who had made the report. We didn't hear that there was a lot of understanding that an investigation process can be looking more at the lack of controls that were in place that allowed this incident to occur. How do we strengthen? What can we do to strengthen the controls to prevent these incidents from happening? Rather than going down the path, seeing an investigation as needing to find out facts, needing to find out if somebody is a bad person and needing to do something about that bad person. That seems to be the way that investigations are being understood. It's about hunting down that bad person and doing something about that bad person. That is not a very effective way of dealing with these risks that exist around psychosocial behaviors. So the recommendations that I'm making in my report, and there are recommendations both aimed at companies, at businesses operating in the mine industry, but also recommendations for the department. Recommendations around needing more dedicated and trained focal people on site, whether that's a committee or smaller organizations, might be an individual, or with smaller businesses, a combined committee between multiple small businesses, where there are dedicated people and they are well trained to deal with these issues. Recommendations around making sure that there are clear protocols and templates in place for how do we deal with a report when it happens in a way that will minimize the risk of harm to people who are reporting, that will minimize the risk of breach of confidentiality, that will allow that person to continue to have ownership over their story. And sorry, the slide looks a little bit cut off there, but we need also this recommendation around integrating these psychosocial the psychosocial risks into a risk management and a safety management framework. This has been spoken about a little bit today, this disconnect maybe between HR and safety, and that often what we've been doing is looking at these issues as a HR issue. One of the things that we were trying to do or hoped to do 13 years ago was to bring that conversation between HR and safety together around gender, and to have safety involved. There needs to be more work there, to have more involvement by safety personnel in the response to and the management of and the prevention of these psychosocial incidents. The last thing that we were also asking them, we wanted to dig down a little bit deeper into inclusion. Into this, what is diversity? We were asking questions around how do people respond to diversity? Are people still on board with it? Is there any backlash? We wanted to understand better what is diversity looking like, diversity inclusion looking like in your organization now, recognizing, as people have pointed out in their other speeches today, that diversity and inclusion is an important part. Increasing diversity and increasing inclusion is an important part of addressing the root causes of some of these behaviors that cause psychosocial harm. So, different groups in the workshops were able to look at different diversity groups. When they were speaking about First Nations in the industry, there was the idea, the suggestion that what we have is a greater appreciation of cultural differences that may affect approaches to work. But there's a noticeable gap in the representation of First Nations people in the workshops that we conducted. While people in the workshops spoke out as a woman in the industry, as a trans person in the industry, nobody spoke out as a First Nations person in the industry. There's a lot of work, I think, that needs to be done there to understand when we're looking at psychosocial risk, psychosocial risk prevention, psychosocial harm response, what does it look like from a First Nations perspective? And what are the differences that we may need to consider? When we asked about immigrants, the workshop attendees were talking about increased participation and visibility. They were saying that some of the businesses now run cultural awareness days where there's opportunities to share different aspects of different cultures. There's an effort to promote multicultural learning. Yet we still have bullying of people who are not necessarily seen to be part of the standard Australian culture, whether that comes through the way they look or the way they talk or the length of time that they've spent in country. When we asked about older workers, we heard that there's a greater recognition that the job gets more difficult for people in the industry as they get older, but there is a sense of shame around admitting to this, and that businesses, the organizations, don't necessarily have in place the systems to manage this, to ensure that there are conversations going on around what does it mean to be an older person in the workplace. How does the change in your physical ability and the change in your attitude, the change in your ability to do the work potentially put you at greater risk of psychosocial harm? Those systems are not in place to have that conversation, and the conversation is not happening. When we asked about persons with disabilities, the attendees were saying that they are seeing increased participation of people with cognitive disabilities in the workplace. There's an increased understanding of different ways of working, but that it's often siloed, that they're seeing that this is happening in administrative roles, but not necessarily in operations, and that persons with physical disabilities are not as visible or not as present in the industry as persons with cognitive disabilities. We asked about trans persons. There is an improved understanding, the industry attendees were saying, in terms of using preferred pronouns, and people spoke about having this on their signature in their email. Even the fact that we were able to talk about trans people in the industry shows a significant shift since we ran the Roadshow in 2010. There were trans people working in the industry in 2010, but at that time, the conversations that I was having with trans people in the industry was around how do I hide my transgender identity so that I can have as good a work experience as possible. Now we had in the workshop people saying, as a trans person in the industry, this is what I'm seeing, this is what I'm experiencing. So we have an improved understanding and improved visibility. There is still some confusion and hesitancy in terms of understanding broadly what trans means, and also some confusion around between trans and sexual orientations, rather than recognizing or understanding trans as a gender identity. Of course, we asked about women. We wanted to know what is the situation like for women in the industry right now, what has improved, and I was expecting to hear great stories. We heard some, but the dominant stories, unfortunately, were that women still feel that they're being underestimated as experienced professionals in the industry. They're still hearing, I think we had this on a slide earlier, they're still hearing that you're only here because you're a woman, even though they've been in the industry for 20, 25 years. They're still hearing that there are certain jobs that you cannot do as a woman, so that their professional capability and their expertise is being underestimated. And another shocking, to me, finding, or what we were hearing, was that there's still a lack of facilities for women on site. I thought we dealt with this issue, but apparently not. We asked about young people. We heard that there are increased concerns among attendees around lower levels of education that younger people have before they come into the industry. We heard that there's concern around younger people taking risks, particularly younger men, continuing to take risks, physical risks, risks of their physical safety in order to get the job done or to prove that they fit in to the industry. And we also heard some issues around young people finding it difficult to work in certain locations. So this puts them at a psychosocial risk when they feel isolated, with young people having a different understanding now than I did when I was their age of what it means to be connected to people. And we also had discussions around lesbian and gay people in the industry. Not one group of all the workshops wanted to take on this particular group to discuss and explore, which suggests to me, and I did have a discussion with some of the groups around why, but it suggests to me that there is either some hesitancy still, there is still a little bit of fear, there is some lack of understanding. There are some gaps in knowledge, therefore, of the situation for lesbian and gay people in the sector. And again, it's not like lesbian and gay people are a new addition to the sector. We have been in the sector for many, many decades. So the conclusion, if I was to sum up and think about the comparison between 2023 and 2010, have attitudes towards psychosocial risks and these particular behaviors, have they changed? Have we moved beyond this preference for a single form of masculinity that if you don't portray, if you don't display, you don't fit in? Have we moved beyond that? Is this no longer an industry in which I need to act, speak, behave in a certain way to fit in? My conclusion is yes, and that should be on one line. My conclusion is yes. And I think I could never have imagined in 2010 that I would be standing in a group in front of 1,100 people from the industry talking about these issues, in front of honourable ministers, in front of leaders of the mining industry. I could never have imagined that. When I was having this conversation at that time, I had a few people, some of who are in the audience today, who were listening. I felt that I was banging my head against a brick wall. And in one case, I was having my head banged against a brick wall on a mine site, because some of the men there were offended that I, according to them, was a traitor. That it was okay at that time to talk about women in derogatory ways. That it was okay to make sure that people you didn't want didn't stay. But it was not okay to point out that there were some flaws in the way that certain men and that the industry was behaving and thinking that were making it very difficult for people to have enjoyable work experiences for all people. That was the situation then, and to stand in front of you now and to be able to talk about the results of a recent roadshow, to me shows huge success, huge change. However, as we've heard, I think, all throughout today, there is a lot more work to be done. We're not there, we're not finished. It's yes, there have been changes, but it's only been partial change. We need to see improvements in how we respond to these incidents in a way that is supportive of the people that are affected and reporting. We need to see improvements in that space. We need better training, use of methodologies that we know work to help people change their attitudes towards and their practices of behaviors that cause psychosocial harm. We need continued efforts to increase diversity in the workforce, but we also need to start thinking about diverse work practices. It's not just about diversity of people, but diverse thinking and practices. We need senior leaders to be participating in the training programs, in the change, in the journey, recognizing that they are part of the culture in which these behaviors have been able to be played out. And we need, I believe, and maybe this is the challenge for the next 13 years. It will not be me here in 13 years presenting again. But I think we believe we need to start having a serious, yet it will be uncomfortable debate around male-male sexual harassment and violence on our mine sites. Thank you.